All right, welcome back into the podcast. I am excited to do this. This individual and I, we talk all the time on Twitter, going back and forth because both of us have a passion, enjoy Chicago Bears history and Chicago sports history. But we've actually never done this. We've never connected on a podcast. So very excited to have him on. He is Jack Silverstein, the great author, the writer. So many great pieces on Windy City Gridiron, and you follow him on Twitter at Read Jack, and he joins me now. Jack, Bill Zimmerman, good to have you on. How are you?
I'm well, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm excited to do this, and we've been talking about this for a few weeks about trying to get together and talk a little Hall of Fame. But something else happened. So before we dive in, got a lot of different angles to do on the Hall of Fame here. But before we dive in, let's dive into Tom Brady. Officially announced his retirement again, but I think everyone's confident this one's going to stick. And we were talking about it, and obviously, I think there's no really way anymore to say he's not the GOAT. He's not the number one on anyone's NFL list. It's hard to go any other direction at this point. But the one thing I thought about when I was, all right, well, here, I'm going to pause. That face, for those of you on listening on the podcast channel, Jack's face was going to disagree. So, Jack, I'm going to give the floor to you. So you don't think Brady is the lock top GOAT in the NFL?
Oh, in the NFL? Oh, no, certainly not. I don't think a quarterback should be considered. I think you need a level of physicality to be considered the GOAT in football, which I also don't think can possibly exist in a sport like football, where you have so many people on the field at the same time doing drastically different tasks and responsibilities. If it is possible, I do think it's someone whose job requires physicality as opposed to the avoidance of physicality. When Lawrence Taylor does his job well, there's a collision. And when Tom Brady does his job well, there isn't. And there's something about tackle football that I think necessitates that physicality. So no, I would never call a quarterback the GOAT. That face was assuming you were talking about whether he's the GOAT of quarterbacks. Yeah, he probably is. I think that the best you can do with anyone in any of these discussions is put them in a top tier. And what I've settled on is, if I had to pick one quarterback to win a game to save my life and the life of my family, it would be, and I wasn't allowed to know offense, defense, home, away, weather, anything. It would be Brady. It would be Brady or Montana. And ultimately, I think I would pick Brady because I'm younger. So I saw everything that Brady did starting at Michigan. And also, when I was watching him, I knew what I was looking at as opposed to Montana. I was younger. And so my appreciation can come along as well. And also, he was, at Notre Dame before I was born. So I didn't have that aspect of it. Montana had the misfortune in this respect of playing at a time where Leonard Marshall could end your career, or at least, put you out long enough to then leave. And, Tom Brady doesn't come back from the 2008 injury if it happens in 1990. I mean, I don't think he plays, and think about how much of his resume is after 2008. Everything before 2008, once you had 2007, where it was like, all right, you give him these weapons, he can put up these Peyton Manning numbers. Basically, after that point, you were like, all right, I've seen enough. Think about what he did after 2008, and think about how much longer Joe Montana could have gone. Joe Montana, 4-0 in a Super Bowl, never threw an interception in a Super Bowl. It's one of my favorite stats. But yeah, you got to go with Brady. But I think it's Brady, it's Montana. Peyton Manning played the position better than I ever saw, and just in postseason could very rarely do it in the best way that he did it in the regular season. But as far as just being a tactician and running an offense, and how he was able to do it in Indy and immediately take it over to what were they, 8-8 with Tebow, and he comes over and they're like an offense we've never seen before with the same guys. I mean, Peyton Manning got Brandon Stokely 1,000-yard season. He got Reggie Wayne into the Hall of Fame. I mean, he's unbelievable. So those guys, Marino, and then, Unitas for what he accomplished, Otto Graham, Sammy Baugh for what he kicked off. Sid. I mean, you kind of have to go generationally. But yeah, if I had to boil it down, I don't think there's any way that you could ask a question about quarterbacks that Tom Brady wouldn't end up in the top three. And then there's other guys who would they be like number one in one category and 5 or 6 in another one. Tom Brady would be in every single case. He's like MJ in that respect. Like whatever the category is that you want to use, try to dice up the GOAT discussion. Michael Jordan's going to be 1 or 2, maybe 3, 1 in most of them, and Tom Brady the same way. So yeah, Brady.
Yeah, and you know, I like the way you approach that in a lot of different ways, and I do think it's interesting because I think you know when you look at the full resume of Brady, you know, you start getting into well, I know Brady's been to so many Super Bowls, but you know, like the stats you brought up about Montana, maybe Montana's the better Super Bowl quarterback, maybe Peyton Manning's the better regular season quarterback. You know, maybe there's others that do other things, but when you look at everything
Together,
so high everywhere that he gets that mantle. And the other thing you bring up, and I as someone who loves history, I get frustrated with this, where like you brought up Baugh and Luckman and what they did. And I always talk about Baugh and Luckman. Baugh and Luckman were the original Brady and Manning to me. That's what I always bring up. That was a rivalry there in the 40s. You know, they were heads and tails, the best quarterbacks of their era. And you sometimes, you know, you get the younger people that don't appreciate history as much. Like, well, you know, if you drop Sid Luckman in 2017, he couldn't even, you know, be in the NFL with his skills. And I'm like, when you look at that, you have to look to me. It doesn't matter because, like, you know, if you dropped Brian Urlacher in 1947, he would be, you know, I know he's a Hall of Famer, but he would be the greatest football player without question. He's bigger than offensive linemen. He's faster than all the running backs. He would be a mutant. But to
reduce that. If you drop Dante Jones into 1947.
Yeah,
it's an irrelevant point. Like, yeah, of course. I mean,
yeah, like you have to look at these guys within their ears and what they did and what they accomplished. So when you sit there and you're like, all right, I want to compare Sid Luckman to Johnny Unitas to Joe Montana, you can't just sit there and line up the statistics and just go, well, you know, it's not even a comparison. You have to look at these guys with what they did within their ears.
Yeah, I mean, with Brady, it's interesting because he played so long, but he played over multiple eras and he played over multiple types of teams. I mean, those early Patriot teams were defense dominated, ball control, you know, just everybody hit their marks. He didn't have a Pro Bowl. Well, Troy Brown went to a Pro Bowl in 01. So his only Pro Bowl receiver or tight end over those first 3 Super Bowls was Troy Brown. I think Corey Dillon may have gotten to the Pro Bowl in 04. And if not, I mean, he had his best year, it was 1,600 yards. So I think he did. And he would have been his only Pro Bowl running back. And he's, you know, steady guiding that offense. Then they gave him Moss, Welker, Stallworth, and he breaks the touchdown record. Puts up, you know, one of the greatest seasons we've ever seen.
Sure.
Then they go to Gronk. And then he kind of like goes back to the smaller, you know, directional guys. So like in the first run, it was Givens, Patton, Brown, Branch, and then the second one it was Edelman, Amendola, you know, I don't know, LaFell that one year, Malcolm Mitchell, I think was his name that one year, Hogan.
Even utilizing guys like James White out of the backfield.
James White out of the backfield. Then he had that middle run where, remember, their offense was 2 tight ends when they had the first year with Gronk and Aaron Hernandez.
Right.
So he's had like all these different types. You know, New England went from being like a run team to a pass team and then back to a run team. That 2018 team was run first. So he's been able to do it in all these different situations. He also, for as many games as he played, as many big games as he played, he doesn't really have what I would call the big mistake. I mean, you can make a mistake, like he's got a pick 6 in a Super Bowl, but they won the Super Bowl. I mean, they came back, and obviously the plays he made in the fourth quarter and overtime, nobody remembers the Alford pick. He you know, he's got maybe that Champ Bailey interception where it was like that was the key play that lost, but at that point he'd had 3 championships in his first seasons as a starter. First 5 seasons in the league, he didn't play his rookie year. So you got the Champ Bailey one. I mean, he had a pick in the end zone against Seattle, but again, he won that game. And a pick in the end zone against Carolina, but he won that game. So he doesn't have, like, in all of these games that he plays, he doesn't have like the big mistake. He doesn't have that stink bomb moment. He doesn't have, Brett Favre's last 3 years basically ended with him throwing interceptions, whether one single interception in the championship game in 07 and 09, or like that string of interceptions with the Jets down their stretch. He doesn't have a Tracy Porter play. He doesn't have, Elway has those bad Super Bowl losses, obviously. He doesn't have any of that. He just doesn't have any of those things. And for someone who threw as many passes as he did, was in as many big games as he was, you can't really even pin. He's got 3 Super Bowl losses. One of them, he led what could have been a game-winning drive to Moss. One of them, the ball was in the air. It's the only time that the Super Bowl has hit zeros on the clock with the game in the balance, where if that ball is caught and it landed in the end zone, if that ball is caught on that Hail Mary without an extra point, the Patriots win. And if it's dropped, the Giants win. And it was dropped, obviously, and the Giants won. And then in his 3rd Super Bowl loss, he set a new record. He said it the year before. He set a new record for most passing yards in a Super Bowl in one game with 505.
And the most points scored in a losing team in the Super Bowl's history.
Most points scored in a losing team. It was the most combined yards of any game in NFL history. And he, after that Jake Elliott field goal, I mean, he moved them down. He moved them right down. He and Gronkowski, when Gronk was whatever that leg injury was. I mean, go back and watch that last drive against Philly in Super Bowl 52. Gronkowski one of the best performances. That I always remember that one more than any of the others that he had, because it was just like on one leg. It's like TO. So you look at that and you just think about how many games this guy's been in, how many passes he's thrown, how many drives he's had to lead. And he doesn't have that big mistake. He doesn't have the big, like, what are you doing? He just doesn't have it. So it's remarkable.
Yeah, and the one thing, and we were going back and forth on this a little bit on Twitter, is the one thing that I wish Brady had, and this is no fault of his. This isn't like me trying to like knock him. Is the signature moment, right? Like that ESPN or whoever can just choose anytime you want to talk about this guy's greatness, that play that you can just put out there. And, like Joe Montana's really got 2 of them. He's got the throw to Dwight Clark. He's got the John Taylor throw to win the Super Bowl against the Bengals. Some guys have them, some guys don't. Like I was actually talking to a Bears fan about this. It was, well, what's Walter Payton's signature moment? Because he didn't score in the Super Bowl. And I said, and that's one of those things where you wish Walter had that highlight that could come with Walter. And for me, it's actually funny. My signature moment, if you picture Walter Payton, what's the first thing that pops in your head in terms of highlights is after he broke Jim Brown's record with the high five and Otis Wilson's big hug. Like that's the one that pops in me first. And that's not even on the field. And there's so many amazing moments he had on the field. But
no, I think of those head down runs against.
There's so many of those. Like I think the jersey getting pulled out, and there's so many great moments. But for me personally, that's like the first thing I think of, because I remember, and it's probably a personal moment because I remember watching that with my dad, and I'm a little kid, and it was just so it was a huge deal. Like that totally. That record doesn't have the same, I think, aura that it had then because of the way the NFL's changed. When Peyton passed Jim Brown, that was a magical moment. That was just, it was one of those things. But like for Brady, I can't, there's not one that jumps off at the page at me. You had a couple that you came up with, but like, I almost wish for him that comeback against the Falcons ended with a Tom Brady touchdown pass. I know James White.
Excellent. It got close.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's to me, I wish Brady had that moment. And I always want these superstars, the best of the best, to have those moments that you can just remember. But, I know you've got a few with Brady, but yeah, none of them really just pop for me like some of these others.
The final drive against St. Louis, that one pops for me. That was one of those, I thought, singular They're backed up. Remember, they were up 17-3. They had the fumble recovery that Tabucky Jones ran back that got
Right.
called back on a hold. And then from that point, Kurt Warner scores on a QB sneak, and then they had the pass to Prohl to tie it. And it was like, oh boy, here come the Rams, like fun while it lasted for this weirdo, little engine that could football team. And, of course, you've got Madden on the call saying, yeah, I think they should just down it and play for overtime, which I remember being like, yeah, they probably should down it and play for overtime because they're backed up. And who's this guy again? And the way he just went down, the one that I told you about and the one that I always think of is the Troy Brown
Right.
throw, that crossing pattern that brought them across midfield, and where all of a sudden it clicked in. You'd been from like, this is going overtime to all of a sudden, oh, they're going to get a shot at a field goal. And you're thinking about Vinatieri having hit the 2 against Oakland 2 rounds earlier, in the snow game. And that Troy Brown one, the way that Brady moves to his left just with those 2 extra steps, and there's nothing happening from his hips, basically from above his hips. His shoulders aren't moving, his head isn't moving, and it's just his legs, and then the pass, and the way that he led Brown, it was not in stride, it was a little bit ahead of stride that made Brown like he was right there for it, but it just kind of gave him that extra click of momentum to angle him toward the sideline, but on an angle where he could continue to run. Oh, it was beautiful. That to me is that drive, and that particular play of that drive are the ones for me.
Yeah, and that's what I always think a lot of times you forget about when you go back and you look at Tom Brady's career, he's won all the Super Bowls and everything, but like at that moment, he was just this guy who would replace Drew Bledsoe and was hot, and nobody knew what this guy was other than he was having this kind of this, I know he wasn't a rookie, but this magical rookie season is what it felt like. And that, once Bledsoe was healthy, Belichick stuck with the kid. They were huge underdogs to the greatest show on turf, the best offense by far, and Kurt Warner and Marshall Faulk and this huge team. Like, you sometimes, I think, forget what it was in the moment when you look back at it and just go, well, yeah, Brady won a bunch of Super Bowls and he's an all-time great, but you forget about what it was in that moment to beat that team.
It was Warner, Dilfer, Brady, Brad Johnson. It was 4 in a row where people were like, oh, you can win a Super Bowl with anybody. Now, 2 of those anybody's, one of them turned out to be one of the greatest athletes we've ever seen. Another one turned out to be a Hall of Famer, but 2-time MVP and a 3-time Super Bowl winner. Super Bowl
conference winner, right?
Conference winner, yeah, Super Bowl participant. And when Warner finished his 3 Super Bowls, those 3 Super Bowls were the 3 highest passing games in Super Bowl history. He had all 3. But for a little while there, it was like Elway retired, and then we went. Warner, this out of nowhere guy, Dilfer, who came in to start, I think, like week 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there for Tony Banks, and didn't do much. Just did just enough. And Brady, and then Brad Johnson. And it was like, and then even Brady in the next one was still kind of like, oh, they're back because they missed the playoffs in 2002. It was still like, oh, okay, yeah, they're back. And he had, they were 14-2, and he had a great Super Bowl. And it really wasn't until the next year where it was like, oh yeah, this guy's like, he's going to be he's like one of the greatest ever. Now you're already in bust test territory with him by 2004.
Yeah, absolutely. It turned that quick. All right. So enough about Brady. I mean, this is a Bears podcast. So let's jump into the Bears here, because, there's several interesting modern era candidates for the Bears that we can discuss. And obviously the top one has to be Devin Hester. I think we're both going to be in very firm agreement here. And while I wish, like Hester could get kind of that first ballot nod and get in, like Brian Urlacher, I think a lot of people don't realize or remember how much there was about him not being a first ballot guy, because Ray Lewis was on the ballot, 2 linebackers. That doesn't happen that often, but, Urlacher was able to get in. Hester's waiting. I think he's going to wait again for another year, maybe 2, but I am confident he's going to get in what I still would say is relatively quickly for a specialist like this, with kind of how the Hall of Fame voters work. But where are you in Devin and kind of the pantheon and his career and the uniqueness, I guess, is the best way of what he did in an NFL on the NFL field?
Well, my first point would be he is not just unusually fast to Canton, he's historically fast for a special team. One thing I would really love fans to understand about the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and I think it's something that voters should speak more about and make more clear, and that other football reporters should make more clear, is that we do now have 20 years of voting data that show pretty clear patterns in the semifinalist era. The semifinalist era started in 2004. So before then, there was a fat pool of players, and then they went straight to the finalists, which is the last 15, and they went from there. Now we have the semifinalist era, which is 25, and that started in 2004. So this is the 20th year. Every first ballot semifinalist is either in the Hall of Fame or they're on the ballot right now. The longest they've had to wait is 11 years. The longest a first ballot finalist has had to wait is 6 years. The longest a first ballot finalist who makes the final 10, so they have a cut down from 15 to 10, the longest those people have had to wait is 3 years in the past 10 years or so. So that basically puts Devin and Andre Johnson and DeMarcus Ware in by next year. So I'm not even worried about that or thinking about that. Once I saw that Devin was a first ballot semifinalist, I went, cool. Once I saw he was a first ballot finalist, I went, yeah. I mean, the only question around Devin was, were they going to hold special teams against him? Were they going to hold just a returner against him? When they put him in where they put him, that question was answered. So that I don't even think about him anymore. I have a run of 7 guys who I think there's only 7 I think who have a shot, and I've sort of added an 8th when I was running through this with Rondé Barber. I had reasons, and I can explain him why I have him 8th, but there's only 7 to 8 guys who have a shot at this year. Devin's one of them. He's going to be in the next 2 years. It's not even worth talking about. As far as his career goes, he's got that same element that Brady has, that Jordan has, where pick a category for returner, and he ranks high in it. So he's the greatest punt returner of all time. You can say Gale Sayers is the greatest kick returner of all time. You can say Cordell Patterson is the greatest kick returner of all time. But Devin Hester has some of the greatest kick returns ever. He also twice led the league in kick return yardage for a season. Let me just get it because I don't have it, but I believe he twice or at least once led the league in kick return average. He's led the league in punt return yards, punt return average, touchdowns for both. He, again, yeah, all right. So he never got kick average, but he was above 35 once in 2010. I mean, he was above 25 1, 2, 3, 4 straight years in the back half of his career, starting with the Bears in 2012. Punt return average twice, punt yards twice, kick yards twice. So if you look at a lot of those guys, Cordell Patterson might be the best kick returner ever. I think he only has 1 career punt return. Eric Metcalf is one of the best punt returners ever, and his kick returning good, not as good. Dante Hall had a nice
Dante Hall is excellent. I think he gets forgotten a little.
Yeah, well, so Dante Hall has a nice mix, but he really only has 2 or 3 years at that level. And it's so unusual to have 2 or 3 years at that level that you start to talk about Dante Hall as one of the greatest returners ever. Devin Hester has 3 different Dante Halls in his time. He had 06, 07, which might be the 2 greatest return years ever. He had 10, 11, and then he had 13, 14. 14 was with the Falcons. So he was able to continually put up those big chunks of yards and impact. And impact is another important one because it wasn't just, obviously he had the Super Bowl return that's at the beginning of the game, but he had a number of big returns that were toward the end of the game. Think about, obviously, most famously, the Arizona comeback, Think about the double returns against Denver. Think about the second return that he had against St. Louis, where they were getting a little bit of life. He put them away. He put Minnesota away in 06.
Sure.
He had the fourth quarter return against Detroit in 07. If he hadn't had that total breakdown there, that might have looked more like a winner. He had basically a clincher against Green Bay in week 3 in 2010. And his final game ever, I mean, this is another item that people forget about. His final game ever was with the Seahawks.
Right.
And he set his personal record for most kick return yards in a playoff game, or maybe I'll check on this. I think it was 178 yards. But I mean, he was doing it. He had a punt return touchdown in his first career NFL game, and he set a personal record in his final career NFL game. I mean, he was able to just return kicks, return punts in a way that and steadily over the course of many years. So not, Desmond Howard, 1996, that's got to be in the running for the greatest return season ever. I mean, to win Super Bowl MVP, set a record for yardage. He had a touchdown also in the divisional round against San Francisco. I mean, he was doing kicks, punts. He was amazing. Better at punts. The Super Bowl touchdown actually is Desmond Howard's only career kick return for a touchdown. So like, he's a legend off of just 1 year. And Devin's got like 6 of those years.
Right.
It's unheard of.
Yeah, Devin's incredible, and like you bring up the Desmond Howard and Super Bowl MVP, and I've always thought to myself, if Lovey and the Bears actually continue to give the ball to Thomas Jones, and Rex doesn't have the crippling pick six, and the Bears manage to win that one, I think Thomas Jones may have been Super Bowl MVP, but that Devin Hester kick return as like a tone setter, there would have been high consideration for Hester to have that MVP had the Bears pulled that one off. Obviously didn't happen. Peyton Manning's the MVP, but I always think that's interesting. And the one name we didn't bring up for returns, because obviously he's known more on defense, but it was Hester who broke the record for most return touchdowns with Deion Sanders. The one thing I think is that's so remarkable.
Rod Woodson is third.
Right. But they've got defensive touchdowns. They've got pick sixes in the mix.
It's return touchdowns, correct.
Yeah, and Devin's able to do that with just kicks and punts, just shows how much heads and tails he is. Because, like you said, returners, for whatever the reason, have a pretty short shelf life in terms of dominance, and he was just able to continue to do it.
Yeah, sorry, I blurred 2 things. So in Hester's final game, his final return of his career, his final NFL play, was a 78-yard kick return. His total was 194 return yards, which was his postseason. That was his postseason record. Yeah, I mean, there aren't many Super Bowls in which the most memorable, most famous play is from the losing team.
Right.
And this is a game that had one of the biggest, most clutch defensive plays in Super Bowl history. Kelvin Hayden, pick six, basically sealed it. And although it's funny, the way offenses have changed and the vast difference between, obviously Rex Grossman and Tom Brady, we had more time on the clock after the Kelvin Hayden pick six, down 2 scores. We had more time on the clock than Seattle had when they were down 24-14 than the Patriots had,
right,
when they were down 24-14 to Seattle in Super Bowl 49. We had more time on the clock than they had. But Thomas is probably Super Bowl MVP if we keep running, even though Devin did what he did. I mean, but they, wisely took him out of the game. But yeah, I've always said, if we had kept running the ball, I think we win that game. If the Bears team that played the Saints played the Colts, and we could have subbed in Adrian Peterson after Cedric got hurt, and Cedric Benson was just an absolute force down the stretch in 2006, and people shouldn't limit him to this perception of that he's this or that, or they like to kill him for the Super Bowl. He left after the fumble. We were still up 14-6. I mean, it was that game was not on Cedric. He was such an incredible part of that team. Rest in peace. But we could have put Adrian Peterson in there when we needed some other back. Olin Cruz told me, he points to I think it was like a second and short that we ran like a 7-8 step drop for Rex, and Booger McFarland sacked him to knock him back to 3rd and long, and then shortly thereafter had to punt. And he points to that and is like, if Cedric was in that game, that's a run to Benson, short yardage. But yeah, I mean, we should have kept going to Thomas. If we had kept going to Thomas, he's probably Super Bowl MVP. And if he's Super Bowl MVP, then we don't trade him. And if we don't trade him, then he retires 2nd all-time in Bears history in rushing yards after Walter Payton. And then we're talking about Thomas Jones as having a shot at the Hall of Fame.
Yeah,
and he's
good
being
point.
mentioned more with, basically all these 2000 backs. So there's a whole mess, and don't get me started on that, or get me started. I don't care. It's late. But if Thomas Jones retired as Super Bowl MVP for the Chicago Bears at running back and ended his career second only to Walter Payton, yeah, he's in the Hall of Fame mix for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, his stats without that are underrated, and we can get into that. But only had so much time, and there's a bunch of Bears I want to get into with you. And I think the next one to get into is the one that I think's the most debated, because he doesn't get a ton of love. Bears fans love him, and of course he does have something signature that will continue to live on. That's the peanut punch. Of course, I'm talking about Charles Tillman, Peanut Tillman, and he is a really interesting case, because I think, because of what he did with the peanut punch, and that it is referenced constantly now as the peanut punch, and used, and taught for defenses and defensive backs. I almost feel like he's getting more conversation about this now than he did when he retired. Because the one thing I would say about Charles Tillman is, and the stats are excellent. Like I said, the peanut punch is something that absolutely should play into it for him. But when I'm a small room guy, I feel I have pretty high standards. If you're on the bubble, I usually would say I would lean against. But for Charles Tillman, it's the eye test. And for me, when I look back at those, as good as he was, I don't snap to it and say he's a Hall of Famer for me. Now you can convince me either way. He's definitely a fence guy for me. And I know a lot of Bears fans don't like to hear me say something like that. I'm gonna guess you're gonna even disagree with me, but that's the one thing I say. I don't sit there be like, I don't feel like he was a dominant force in all aspects of being a defensive back. And you can fight me off if you want.
Yeah, Deion Sanders has obviously made headlines. He said something interesting about the idea that there should be a Hall of Fame in the Hall of Fame. I don't agree with that, but I think the point that Deion's making I think where it's really valuable is to know that there are 2 levels. There are the stand up, sit down guys, where the presenter stands up, says the name, and sits down. And whoever presented Brett Favre did that. I believe Peyton Manning did. I'm reading Dick Butkus's autobiography right now, and Cooper Rollo did that for him. He stood up and said, from the Chicago Bears, Dick Butkus, enough said, and sat back down. First ballot Hall of Fame. So you've got those guys, and those guys are all going in. And whether they go in the first ballot, or they, because of the breaks of it, they slip second, third, Marvin Harrison, Shannon Sharp, guys like that. I think John Randall maybe he was first, but there have been guys up there. Derek Thomas, was a little bit later.
Yeah.
But they were going to be finalists immediately. Thurman Thomas was second ballot. I think Chris Carter was third. So there's going to be stuff like that where those guys are just snap your fingers and they're in, and everybody else, there's an element of a judgment call and an aspect of what is your criteria. To me, on Charles, I look at his era and I say it should have been Champ Bailey and Charles Woodson, and then let's all just take a big breather. Ty Law has some of the most incredible clutch plays at the biggest moments. Super Bowl pick 6 when they needed it, the 3 picks on Peyton in the 2003 AFC Championship, and had a long and storied career. and I'm not I'm not an expert on cornerback play, but I think that most people are also not experts. And in that respect of really looking at tape, shout out to Pierce Comboy and Brian Fry. But in really looking at tape, who is, who isn't, I look at those guys and I just say, like, after those two and Revis, I mean, I don't see huge differences in talent, skills, personal production between Peanut and Ty Law and Rondé Barber. I just don't. I think that if Charles was on the 2002 Bucks, he'd have a ring, and if Rondé was on the 2006 Bears, he wouldn't. And I think Rondé is about to go into the Hall of Fame this year or next because of that ring. 4 defensive players on that team that won 1 championship. I'm not trying to diminish a championship, but he's the 4th in terms of sequence. I mean, you Brooks, if they all were eligible the same year, you'd have Brooks and Sapp, and then I don't know, Lynch and Barber were on the ballot at the same time. And the guy who stood out the most in that season and in that game was Simeon Rice. So, I mean, as far as the 2002, I mean, Rondé Barber's got a huge career after 2002, but that's the biggest piece of his resume. And if you switch him and Charles is going to the Hall of Fame. But I don't think that that's like a controversial statement. I also think that people, I knew this, you probably knew this, but I think it took a long time for the general public to catch up on what Charles was doing and what the forced fumble meant to his game. And not necessarily even in a one day they'll be teaching this kind of a thing, but just as a weapon. I mean, I think his greatest peanut punch is in the Super Bowl. Punch out, pulls a dude up, dives down, recovers. And that's all him. That's not someone's bad throw. That's not someone hitting the quarterback on a pass rush. That is him standing up a dude one-on-one and punching the ball free and falling on it. And that's one of the greatest individual plays I've ever seen in the Super Bowl. So you can't take that away. And he was doing stuff like that. I mean, I remember the game in 2007. He was supposed to be injured. Week 5 against the Packers. We were 1-3. It was a night game. Maybe it was a Monday night game or it was a Sunday night game. It was a national game and it wasn't a Thursday. We won 27-20. It was one of the greasy games. And on back-to-back possessions at the start of the game, they ran James Jones on a little, 3-yard in, and Tillman, popped it out twice in a row. Just him doing it. He had so many of those kinds of moments. But I don't think that voters, and I don't think that the national media, I don't think anyone outside of Chicago and maybe like serious film heads and like maybe masters of the position who in those days didn't have quite as easy access to having a voice as we have now. I don't think they realized what he was doing and the impact that he was having. And by the time they caught up, it was almost too late, where the next Peanut Tillman, the next person who has Peanut's career, he'll be having all those Pro Bowls that he should have had starting in 2005. Like, I think you can call him judgment call 2005, 2006 for the Pro Bowl, and then 2007 through 10 to like he was a Pro Bowler, and he kept getting beat out by guys who just had a career year on interceptions. D'Angelo Hall's, awesome player. He's not better than Charles. He had a dope year in 2010, 4 interceptions off Jay Cutler, basically got him to the Pro Bowl over Charles that year. Charles had a better all-around year. By the way, he was also out there on punt block. He was also blocking for Devin. Look at how many of Devin's punt return touchdowns have Charles down as the final block or one of the final 2 blocks. And that just speaks to his physicality. I mean, he would get in there and tackle. He wasn't a big tackle for loss guy. He only had 3 sacks, but he was very physical. You could put him in man. We saw what he did to Calvin Johnson the year that Calvin Johnson set the NFL record for receiving yards. His worst game was against the Bears, 3 catches, 34 yards, no touchdowns. And that was a close game. It was like a 7-point game. And and Charles had a stop on him in the end zone. It doesn't count as a forced fumble, but it was a punch out, but it was defending a pass. We saw him go toe to toe with Randy Moss. We saw him go toe to toe with Plaxico Burress. So we saw him go at these wide receivers. I watch him and I'm like, that dude is someone who kept getting better every year. And there's another one. If you win the Super Bowl, now you look at all those players differently. We win that Super Bowl, and he probably does have 2 or 3 Pro Bowls before 2011 and 2012. Charles Tillman is a 5-time Pro Bowler and Super Bowl champ by virtue of nothing different that he has done, but just by virtue of certain elements around him outside of his control, then yeah, we're not even having this as a question. So when I look at Charles, I see someone who played his position extremely well, very little letdown. I think sometimes there was this perception that, he got beat, like Bernard Berrien, 99 yards with the Vikings. And it's like, that's not Charles getting beat. That's the cover 2 breaking down. Right. Charles had him in the first 5 yards. He goes by, the safety doesn't have it. But that's also Charles running, even though he's not going to catch Bernard Berrien from like 15 yards away. But he's a legitimate play to the whistle guy. I mean, he's a ground ball to second and you run it out kind of guy. And it was that kind of don't quit element that was able to, force another fumble on Chris Johnson or get that, snatch that pass away from Randy Moss. So, yeah, I think you take that just as a player, even before you now get to the impact of the peanut punch, the fact that it's being taught in DB rooms, it's being studied, film study in DB rooms. And now you look at like Marlon Humphrey had a couple of years ago where he was a Pro Bowler. He only had 1 interception, but he had 8 forced fumbles. That's a Peanut Tillman line. That is a line that without Peanut existing, first of all, Marlon Humphrey has studied film on Charles. But let's say somehow independent of that hadn't happened and he just did that on his own. If Charles had that line in 2006, he would not have gone to a Pro Bowl because they'd have been like, he only has 1 interception. So when you're a pioneer, you don't get credit for the things that you've created. The next Charles is going to get Pro Bowls that our Charles should have gotten or could have gotten or would have gotten. And it doesn't make him a different player. It just makes elements around him different. But yeah, I mean, now when you see, every week in college and the pros, someone mentions Charles and they're not mentioning it, for a while they would mention it like if you had a punch out, they'd be like, oh, it reminds me of Charles Tillman. And now someone has a punch out and it's like, we talked to his coach this week and he spent all week studying film of Charles Tillman. It's not, the connection is right. Precise. So Charles is really interesting because his case, I can't think of anybody whose case has gotten better in retirement. I would say like, hey man, some of these guys, like, they're not going to throw another pass. I said this with the seniors. Like I wanted last year when they voted in 3 seniors, and basically we don't know yet when we're recording this right now on February 6th. They voted January 17th. We don't know yet, but they're going to vote in all 3 seniors. It would be kind of a really bad look if they didn't. And I thought, well, you should just vote in 9. They said they're going to do 3 or a max of 3 for each of the next 3 years. And I said, vote in 9 because these older guys, like they don't want to go through this stress every single year. It takes you like 2 or 3 months maybe out of your routine, cameras in the house, wondering, is this happening, etc. No one's going to, throw another pass, make another tackle. Your resume isn't improving, but somehow Charles's resume is improving in retirement. He could go his first 10 years of eligibility and not make the semis, and I'd still be like, he's got time. It's all good.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a lot of good points, and that's the one thing I think is the most interesting is the credit he's been building as his retirement continues. But the next name I want to bring up is, and what I think is interesting about him is when I'm able to talk to Bears players from the past, from the, let's just call it the Lovey era. And I had Brian Urlacher on the podcast, at the start of the football season in September. And I asked him, like, which teammate of yours, do you think deserves, Hall of Fame credit? and isn't getting it. And yet he brought up Tillman, and we brought up Lance Briggs and all this, but the first name, and he's not the first one to do this. The first name, when I talk about guys from the Lovey Bears and I ask them about the Hall of Fame, usually the first name that comes out of their mouth is Olin Kreutz. And Olin does not get nearly the love, despite having a couple really nice accolades on his career, in terms of awards. Where are you with Olin?
So number one, I think Olin's a Hall of Famer. Number two, I think he's another guy who, if we won, this would be over. And that's how it goes. Like, that's there's no debating the impact that a Super Bowl has and what it means, and that's just what it is. Now, I think the thing with Olin is that they just don't put centers in very often. It's basically generational. So they had Mawai, and he was the first one since, I think, Bruce Matthews, and Bruce Matthews was the first one since Dermontti Dawson. And it's like, if you count up the last five,
White Stevenson, it's like one a decade.
Yeah, exactly. If you count up the last five like wide receivers in, you get to like 2015. If you count the last five centers in, you get to like 1987. So that's really the bigger issue. And I think the question that Bears fans should keep an eye on is what happens with Nick Mangold. Because Nick Mangold is, I think, definitely getting in and is kind of that next guy. So if there's someone who gets to the semis before Nick Mangold, or even the same year as Nick Mangold, and is able to advance to the finals before him, if there's someone who gets in there first, then that's a really good sign for that person. Again, what people should know about the Pro Football Hall of Fame, which they should understand, is that nothing has really happened until you're in the semis.
Right.
And then once you're in the semis, depending on where you are in your eligibility, you're like it's basically a wrap. Like, you're basically in, unless the later you're in, the later you get your first semis, the further away you are. But then another trend is, like, once you start stacking consecutive semis, then it starts to be like, okay, now this guy's going to get in. So you're kind of like still okay for Kreutz, for Tom Nalen. And then here's the other problem for Olin, is that there are a number of really good centers who I think were somewhere around his level. And the advantage that he has is that he was second team all decade for the 2000s.
Right.
But
that's the big one for me.
So that's the big one. But then part of that is the breaks, because Tom Nalen's one of those split guys where he had half his career in the 90s and half his career in the 2000s. Chuck Howley got screwed on that. It didn't matter for Marshall Faulk, but Marshall Faulk didn't make an all-decade team. The four guys in the 90s were Emmett, Barry, Thurman, and Terrell Davis. And then the four guys in the 2000s were Tomlinson, Edge, Sean Alexander, and Jamal Lewis. So if someone wants to look at it that way, then that puts Olin in a little bit of a spot. You could say Jeff Saturday won a Super Bowl, Matt Burke won a Super Bowl, Mark Stepnowski won a Super Bowl, Tom Nalen won 2 Super Bowls. But I love Olin's case. I think he's absolutely a Hall of Famer. I think if centers went to the Hall of Fame at the click of wide receivers, we wouldn't be talking about this. Voters, basically, with wide receivers and running backs right now, and probably QBs pretty soon, are pretty much just running down the career yardage list. And that just doesn't exist for offensive linemen. So there's no rubber stamp.
Right. It's an abstract thought,
Correct. So I wouldn't look at Olin yet and say he's in trouble. I think that the first thing to see is, when does Mangold go? So if Mangold gets to the semis and there's no other center in yet, then that could be a problem, except for the fact that if they were to move fast on Mangold, if he was only, if he went from like semis to induction in 5 years, which I think would be his 7th year, I think he just was in his 2nd of eligibility, then yeah, who's the next center after that? Pouncey? I don't know. I mean, it's not great. It's not great, but that's not on Olin. That's just because they just don't put in that many centers.
Right. Now, when we were kind of talking about some of the names to bring up, a couple of the names that you wanted to bring up before we get to a non-Bear that I think is a fascinating conversation, and that's Reuben Brown and Lance Briggs. So I'm just going to tee you up.
Well, Reuben's another guy who, to me, I always watched and was like, Reuben Brown is defining his position, for a very long time, long before he came to the Bears, in Buffalo.
Yeah, he was great in Buffalo.
He was great in Buffalo. And, I've heard some people who now there's like a pushback when I'm like, where's Reuben Brown? They're like, I don't know. Have you seen his holding stats? And I'm like, I don't know, man. Until you show me everybody's holding stats, like, not really that moved by it. I think Reuben Brown was, an elite player for a long time who defined his position. The guy who's in trouble is Briggs. And I ordinarily would not say that someone in their first 5 years of eligibility is in trouble. But Briggs is up against some really bad math. You've got 20 years of eligibility. You've got 5 guys elected a year, or it's max of 5. But basically, at this point, the voters have shown that they're always going to fill out the slots.
They're going to do 5, right?
They're going to do 5, and that wasn't always the case, but now it is. You've got a bunch of guys who are now out ahead of Briggs. So, probably DeMarcus Ware is getting in this year. You can remove him from this conversation. And possibly Zach Thomas is getting in this year. Certainly he's getting in the next few years. And then Patrick Willis is going to get in the next few years after him. Then you're going to have Luke Kuechly. He's going to come up. And you're going to have Terrell Suggs come up. And you're going to have Khalil Mack come up. Then you've got 2 guys who they added this year. They put London Fletcher in the semifinals in his first 5 years. And every player who's gotten to the semis in their first 5 years has gotten in or is on the ballot now, with the exception of Steve Tasker, who obviously has a unique space. And so it's not a surprise that he would be the outlier, because he is an outlier. So that basically means, if London Fletcher falls off the ballot next year, then fine, we can start talking. But London Fletcher being in the semis in his first 5 years, that basically tracks him in. And James Harrison this year was a, first ballot semifinalist. So that tracks him in. He'll be in within 11 years. And then you start to look at guys who are on like the back end of, or who would be coming in at the back end of Lance. So you could end up with like TJ Watt on the ballot at the same time as Briggs. This is going to be a weird one to say, but you could end up with like Roquan Smith being in on the, let's say Roquan starts just stacking hundreds and, starts being a perennial Pro Bowler, get some more all pros. Let's say Baltimore wins a Super Bowl. I mean, all of these things are possible. You could have Roquan Smith in the back end. You could have Levante David in the back end.
Levante David's going to get consideration.
Get consideration
if he keeps this up. Yeah.
So I don't mean in. I just mean like in the mix.
Right. Consideration.
Joey Porter hasn't gotten to the semis yet. He was an all-decade guy in the same decade as Briggs. I forgot Von Miller. I knew I was forgetting somebody. I forgot Von Miller. So the other problem that Lance faces is that the outside linebacker position has now become defined by sacks, which isn't what he did. So you've got Von Miller, who's got huge sack numbers and 2 rings, had a Super Bowl MVP, and came close to being a Defensive Player of the Year. I think he finished second behind Watt one of those seasons, J.J. Watt. You've got Terrell Suggs, who's over 100 sacks and has a Defensive Player of the Year and has a ring. So you've got these sack artists who are going to be, again, an easy stat. I mean, I'll just say that counting stats have been weighing heavily for voters lately. And when you look at the, London Fletcher, second all time in tackles, and tackles is like a goofy stat because it like comes from the team and But like, they're looking and they say, oh, London Fletcher, that. Another interesting point on London Fletcher with regards to this Pro Bowl conversation that we're all having because of Tyler Huntley. London Fletcher is a 4-time Pro Bowler, and all 4 of them were replacements. Twice on an injury, twice on someone going to the Super Bowl and not playing.
I didn't realize that. That's interesting.
So he's got 4 Pro Bowls, and he was never voted in. And Lance Briggs has 7 Pro Bowls, and he was voted in on all 7, including a couple times as a starter.
Yeah, I didn't realize that about Briggs compared to him to London Fletcher. That's interesting.
Yeah, but so that's a real problem. I mean, so Bears fans want somebody to talk up. I mean, if you're looking for Hester, forget about it. Don't worry, he's in. Charles, his case is growing every day. His case is only going to continue to get better. Don't worry about him. I mean, talk him up. You're going to natural. Everybody loves Charles, but he doesn't need that kind of attention. Olin, yes, but I think that's generally not about Olin. Again, that's about centers overall. Reuben Brown, what the hell's going on there? Peppers, when he's on the ballot, he'll get in. You want to talk somebody up, talk up Lance Briggs, and remind people what you saw, what he was able to do. I mean, think about a guy who had the speed to chase down a running back and the power to knock out Calvin Johnson. Think about the way that he would have those plays where, for a guy who didn't have a lot of sacks, he was in the backfield an awful lot when it called for it. I mean, he's a 3-down linebacker. He played a pass beautifully. I mean, his passes defended are huge. And I looked at the numbers of the last 5, I think it was, outside linebackers to get into the Hall, including Derek Brooks. And I looked at Briggs and DeMarcus Ware, James Harrison, and Terrell Suggs. Tackles per game of all those guys I just named. Tackles per game, Brooks is first, 5.8. Briggs is second, 5.5. Interceptions, Brooks is first at 25. Briggs is second at 16. Everybody else is under 10. Interceptions plus fumble return yards. Now, this is something that's coming up, I know, right now. The idea of what did you do with the ball in your hands? I know that Ira Kaufman, for example, is building his Rondé Barber case around that exact statement. 12 defensive touchdowns for Rondé Barber. Interception plus fumble return yards combined. Brooks had 534. Briggs had 288. Everybody else was under 200. Yards per takeaway, same sort of thing. Brooks 18.4. Briggs was second at 12.5. Ware at 12.3. Everybody else under 10. Touchdowns. Brooks had 7. Briggs had 6. And all those other guys had 3 or less. So when the ball was in his hands, he was getting into the end zone. He's knocking passes down. He can rush when he needs to. He was a tackles machine. I mean, what Urlacher said in his speech was true. He said, if I didn't get there, I was just going to be another guy because you were going to make the tackle. And I think that Bears fans need to focus on changing the conversation about OLBs from just sacks to the totality of destruction and all the different elements of your performance. I always looked at Briggs and I said, he's 85% of Derek Brooks, and 85% of a first ballot Hall of Famer is a Hall of Famer.
Yeah, no, that's a good way to look at it, and that's the thing is the way the defense has evolved with 3-4 versus the 4-3. The outside linebacker. What Lance Briggs played and what Khalil Mack played are two completely different
positions.
Yeah,
exactly.
Just because they both say linebacker next to them, it doesn't mean that they should be compared at all.
Right.
But there's one other player I want to kind of get into the finalists and kind of who are your 5. I'll give you my 5. But before we do that, I want to discuss this one player. You brought him up when we were talking pre-show, and like my reaction was, yes, I want to talk about this. I was excited to actually tease this. It's going to be about an hour ago. I teased it. I didn't say who it was. I just said, this is the guy I want to talk about. And when I think about this player, I think this is going to be something kind of odd. But in the movie Back to the Future, when Michael J. Fox is playing Johnny Be Good and he goes into his guitar solo and everyone starts staring at him. And he goes, well, I don't think you guys are ready for it.
Such a good analogy.
Your kids are going to love it.
Your kids are going to love it. Randall Cunningham. I'm stealing that, and I will credit you, but I am for sure stealing that.
That is Randall Cunningham, because he was the first quarterback to play with the mobility and the threat with the legs. And the NFL was not ready for that at the time. This was just something they had never seen before. You know, Bobby Douglas could run, John Elway was mobile, but Steve Young, I guess Steve Young kind of came in with Randall by the time he got the job from Montana. But you hadn't seen what Randall can do. And then Vic came along after that. But now when I say your kids are going to love it, now, and again, I know designed runs, it's not exactly the same offense, but it's Jalen Hurts, it's Justin Fields, it's Lamar Jackson, it's this, Josh
Allen.
It's this new wave of quarterback that you just don't throw for 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns and sit in the pocket. You are a threat behind the line of scrimmage, and it's an entirely new concept of quarterback. That was Randall. And for those who aren't old enough, when you go back, the 1990 season that Randall Cunningham put together might be the most underappreciated season in NFL history. And I know he did well. I think he was second in the MVP that year. But
I got some numbers for you, Bill.
It was remarkable. So when you said you wanted to bring up Randall as I was an Eagles fan, obviously I was always a Bears fan, but Randall was the reason I cheered for the Eagles. He was that fun and electric. So when you said, I want to talk about Randall's case for the Hall of Fame, I was like, absolutely, let's do it.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think there is that element of just like you watch the guy and you sort of just know. But that doesn't really carry the day when you're trying to convince people. And Randall's eligibility as a modern era candidate is up 2026. This is 2023, so 2014. So he's got 3 years left of modern era eligibility, and then it's off to the senior pool, and that's the abyss. So it's got to happen now. I can sit here and we can trade stories about the things that Randall did, and you can, throw on the clips and watch the highlights and, recall how he made us feel as fans and how he made defenses feel. But I think that that's a harder sell with people who are closed off to Cunningham or who didn't see him. And you have to, in that case, and I don't like doing this, but you do have to start with some facts. So you mentioned 1990. Let's look at this. What if I told you that Randall Cunningham was a 3-time MVP?
Well, you'd say he's a lock Hall of Famer.
You sure would. But I suspect a lot of people would say Randall Cunningham didn't even win one MVP. What are you talking about? Randall Cunningham, there are a number of big MVP awards and big All-Pros, different voting bodies.
But the Associated Press is the one that everyone uses.
Correct. And I think that's fine. And I think for the most part, these things balance out. And I think it's useful to be able to have a benchmark and to just say after a certain year, oh, we just say AP. Randall Cunningham in 1988, 1990, and 1998 finished second in the AP MVP voting. And not second as in he got like 1 or 2 votes. Second as in he has 3 of the highest percentages for second place finishers. I looked at it back to 1978, once you got to the 16-game season, that was just like a good cutoff point because it's time consuming to do all this. So I looked at it back to 1978 to make sure you covered all of his peers. And he's got 3 of the highest finishes for a second place guy. In each of those years, he also won the Burt Bell Award. And in 2 of those years, he won another major MVP. The Pro Football Hall of Fame this year tweeted, or I guess last year, but this voting season, tweeted that one of the senior finalists was 1981 Defensive Player of the Year, Joe Klecko. Now, what's wrong with that statement?
I don't know what you're getting at.
Lawrence Taylor won the AP Defensive Player of the Year in 1981.
Okay.
And when you don't specify a voting body, it is common that you are referring to the AP.
To the AP, yep, absolutely.
And the Pro Football Hall of Fame said Joe Klecko, 1981 Defensive Player of the Year, because he won some other voting body. I'll have to look it up, but I think it was the Pro Football Writers Association. If Joe Klecko, according to the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and I don't care who sent that tweet, it came from you, I'm gonna hold you to it. If Joe Klecko was the 1981 Defensive Player of the Year, then Randall Cunningham was the 1990 and 1998 NFL MVP. I'll tell you about his 1990. He lost to Joe Montana. He had more touchdown passes than Joe Montana. He had more combined pass and rush yards than Joe Montana. He had more total touchdowns. And are you ready for this? He had fewer interceptions. He had fewer interceptions than Joe Montana and a higher passer rating.
Wow.
Joe Montana was throwing to Jerry Rice. He had Roger Craig. He had John Taylor. He had Brent Jones. Randall Cunningham had one receiver pass catcher who was getting postseason honors. It was Keith Jackson. In terms of someone who was doing it steadily. 1998, MVP, Terrell Davis, 2,000 yards. Broncos are the defending champs. That makes sense.
Had the undefeated run too. I think they were 14-0.
Had the undefeated run. Randall Cunningham, again, remember, second in the AP MVP voting, high finish, gets the Burt Bell. And then he got the MVP from the NEA. You know what the NEA is?
Newspaper.
But do you know who votes for the NEA?
No.
The players.
Okay.
In 1998, the players of the NFL voted Randall Cunningham as the MVP of the season over a 2,000-yard rusher.
Yeah, there's a lot there with Randall, and I was looking it up while you were talking. Klecko, it was Pro Football Writers and NEA got defensive player for both.
He got them both.
81.
Okay. So
Randall got the 90 from the Pro Football Writers and 98
right.
from NEA.
For the NEA, exactly. So when you look at that, I think you can safely say Randall had 3 MVP seasons. He had 3 seasons where he finished high in the voting for AP. He won a Burt Bell, and the Burt Bell has a Philly slant, but Randall won it 3 times. The only other guys who win it 3 times are Johnny Unitas and Peyton Manning. So if you win it once and you're from Philly, fine. You win it 3 times. I also had someone tell me, a Philly guy, that one of the ways the Burt Bell figures out, who's going to win the Burt Bell, the Maxwell Club, is who's going to show up, and that's why they give it to Philly guys. Randall didn't even show up the first time he won it, and he won it twice more.
Huh.
So when you look at his 3 seasons, 88, 1990, 1998, those are MVP seasons. He's got 3 of them. Now take a look at this. Randall Cunningham, first of all, we were talking about teammates, okay? And, I look at like Jim Kelly. Jim Kelly, very, very good quarterback, worthy Hall of Famer, one of my favorites growing up. But the difference between Jim Kelly and Randall Cunningham is not first ballot Hall of Famer, not in the Hall of Fame. And I think you do have to look at teammates. Jim Kelly's best offensive teammates on the Bills, he had
Thomas, Andre Reed, James Lofton,
all in the Hall of Fame, and All Pro. He had 3 linemen: Ken Hall, Les Richter, and Will Wolford. Do you know how many Hall of Fame teammates Randall Cunningham had on the offensive side of the ball?
Yeah, they were all on defense.
In Philly, 0. And do you know who is an All Pro? 1, Keith Jackson. And when he got the guys who Jim Kelly had in 91, when he got them in Minnesota with Randy and Robert Smith and Chris Carter and Jake Reed, he put up an MVP season. He put up numbers that match what Jim Kelly did in Buffalo. Now, here's another one I really like, okay? Randall Cunningham never had a teammate win AP MVP or Offensive Player of the Year. He never finished behind a teammate in the MVP voting. Here are the quarterbacks who had a teammate who won MVP or Offensive Player of the Year. Joe Montana, Roger Craig, and Jerry Rice.
Sure.
Steve Young, Jerry Rice. Troy Aikman, Emmitt Smith won MVP. Jim Kelly, Thurman Thomas won MVP. Yep. John Elway, Terrell Davis won MVP.
Yep.
Kurt Warner, Marshall Faulk won MVP.
Yep.
Phillip Rivers, LaDainian Tomlinson won MVP. Never had it. You know what else Randall Cunningham never did? He never had a season where he threw more interceptions than touchdowns. Troy Aikman did.
Yeah, which is much, you don't think about that now. You would have almost expected with a lot of quarterbacks in this era, but that was not the case in the 80s and 90s.
Right, exactly. Now, I think that something that has bothered me about the voting pattern here is that right now the committee puts in every quarterback who they elect on the modern era ballot. They put them in on the first ballot. So since Bob Greasy was elected in 1990, they've elected 11 quarterbacks modern era. 10 of them have been first ballot, and the only one who wasn't was Kurt Warner, who, with his super short career, basically was a de facto first ballot because he went finalist, Hall of Fame. So third ballot, and a third ballot for a guy who only had 5 relevant seasons,
right,
is basically first ballot. And what happens when you do that, in my opinion, is that you don't have these growing conversations about someone's candidacy because they basically close the book on quarterbacks. Either you're in or you're not in.
You don't get many guys like Stabler who get in that late as a senior candidate.
It's not happening. It's not happening at all. I mean, maybe it's going to end up happening with Ken Anderson. But again, that's senior. That's down the road. That the odds, once you hit that senior pool, man, your odds drop so far. And if you think about certain guys, how did Sam Mills get into the Hall of Fame? Sam Mills got into the Hall of Fame because people kept talking about his case over a long period of time. And finally, he got into the semis and finally got into the room. And he was in the room for 2 years and they were talking about him and discussing him. And then he went and was elected in his 20th year. Tony Baselli had that long run of not being in the semis because he had that short career. Finally, he gets the semis, he gets the finals, he's in the room. And in the room that's not actually what happens anymore now that it's on Zoom, but in the room for anyone listening is the expression of what happens at the finalist stage, which is the only formal meeting of all the voters. It's the only place in a formal setting where voters are guaranteed. They have all sorts of side conversations throughout the year, but it's the only place in a formal setting where you're going to have the entire voting body together discussing the merits of anybody's case. And it took a long time for Tony Baselli to get in the room. And then it took him a long time to get to Canton. But what happens is that when you got someone who's just sitting in a stage for a long time in the semis or in the finals, people kind of get to a shit or get off the pot point and they shit. And the trend is that they go and they move them along. So if Zach Thomas were a quarterback, based on how they're doing it, he would not be getting into the Hall of Fame because they would have looked at him in that first year and been like, nah, next. And yet he needed that, that run time, even with the all decade. Darren Woodson, who I think we'll get in. Steve Atwater, who took a long time. I think I said Leroy Butler. It sometimes takes a while. And part of what's going on is that you're having that conversation. And some of those really important conversations are happening even before they're elected into the semis because it's that building talk of like, where's so-and-so? And it happens at all other positions, but it does not happen at quarterback. I mean, right. You tell me, when did Donovan McNabb become not a Hall of Fame? All right.
He's not even in the conversation ever.
His rookie year, part-time starter. Second season, second in the MVP vote to Marshall Faulk. Gets Philly into the playoffs. Third season, 2001, conference championship. 4 straight conference championships. When he finally gets a superstar wide receiver, he puts up his best numbers of his career, gets the Eagles to the Super Bowl, which he did without the wide receiver. Because remember, Owens was injured in the NFC playoffs. So that's 99, 01, 02, 03, 04. So through 6 seasons, you're like, yeah, he just had a rough Super Bowl, but this guy's a Hall of Famer. He was hurt a little bit in 07. He was hurt a little bit in 05, a little bit in 06, kind of came back 07, 08. He got them back to the conference championship. And 09, he was a Pro Bowler again. And then 10, he went to Washington. 11, he went to Minnesota, and he was done. But he had a run there from 2000 to 2009. That's a whole decade. And he's doing it with, all due respect to everybody, but he had Bryant Westbrook, who was a 2-time Pro Bowler. Deshaun Jackson made one at the back end. Obviously, he had T.O. I mean, in terms of skill position, his most consistent Pro Bowler was Chad Lewis. But for some reason, black quarterbacks just get stuck with running backs and tight ends. And I think it's because owners, it's this double-edged sword where they go like, we don't need to give him wide receivers. This guy can run anywhere he wants. And then when it comes time to vote for Pro Bowl, All Pro, and really the Hall of Fame, they go, where's the passing yards?
Right.
Voters right now are doing something with running backs and wide receivers. Like I said, they're running down the career yardage marks. And I mentioned earlier that Jamal Lewis and Sean Alexander were second team all decade in the 2000s. And a guy they beat out by the same voting body, because the Pro Football Hall of Fame voters vote for all decade. And so obviously there's some turnover there, but it's the same collective body. A lot of those guys have been there a long time. They turn around 10 years later and they decide, all right, you know what? Never mind. Fred Taylor's better than Sean Alexander and Jamal Lewis. Now, why is that? Is that because of the 1955 yards and I think 20 touchdowns he had in his first 2 seasons, which happened in the 90s, and they don't count, obviously, toward all decade selection? Or is it because he just so happened to end up with like 200 more yards and he's like 17th? And, Sean Alexander's like 25th. Like, is that why? Why are they voting for Fred Taylor? That's not I'm not knocking Fred Taylor.
No, I know what you're saying.
But I'm saying, like, explain it to me. Because if you're just running down the career yardage list, then we might as well have fucking Chat GPT vote for the goddamn Pro Football Hall of Fame. Like, if that's what it's going to be, and that's what they're doing at wide receiver right now. And that's why it's so bothersome that they put Hines Ward and Anquan Bolden and Steve Smith, 3 of my favorite players, but they put them all in as first ballot semifinalists. That cues them in. And what's happening with Hines Ward is they put him in as first ballot semifinalist. Now he just sits there. Every year it feels like an insult. You can't vote him back. You can't not vote him in as a semifinalist. So they just sit there for a long time. And now voters have conversations like, well, what the hell's going on with Hines Ward? Why is he stuck? And whether you think Hines Ward belongs in there or not, it becomes this, self-perpetuating circular logic. You say, like, why isn't Hines Ward in yet? And so it makes you think he should be, and then you get closer and he's gonna get in. And that's happening in every position except for quarterback.
That's an interesting point.
Once you get into the room at quarterback, you're in. Everyone, 10 guys since Bob Greasy, 11 voted in, 10 first ballot, only 1, Kurt Warner, third ballot. Again, he had 5 seasons. Randall Cunningham, 3
and,
MVP.
And Kurt Warner was
3 MVP
was awful.
seasons.
Kurt Warner was awful with the Giants. Wasn't like he was down. He was awful, and he couldn't stay on the field either.
Correct. And you look at, have to look at teammates. Now, Steve Young is one of the prettiest passers that I've ever seen, and he could run his ass off too. I mean, don't forget that. I mean, he should be called a runner as well. But, look at what had to happen for Steve Young to win his championship. First of all, he has to be brought into the absolute perfect offensive situation to just pop right in for Montana when he's ready. Again, he's got Rice. He's got, Ricky Waters.
Ricky Waters was excellent.
Yeah. Okay. So he's got Rice. He's got Ricky Waters. He's got John Taylor. He's got an incredible offensive line. He's got Brent Jones. And then what did San Francisco go out and do when they're getting their ass handed to them by the Cowboys? They retooled that entire defense.
They bought a defense.
So in 93, they drafted Dana Stubblefield, fuck him, and they went out and got Tim McDonald. And then in 94, they, like you said, they bought themselves a defense. They went out and got Ken Norton Jr. from the Cowboys, who was whipping their ass every year. They went out and got Gary Plummer, one of the great, solid pros. I mean, Plummer and Norton, like those like pros, like they get Plummer from San Diego. They draft Lee Woodall. That's an entirely new linebacker core, all 1994.
Yeah, and they
bring Merton.
They brought in Richard Dent, I believe. Dent didn't work out.
They bring Merton Hanks along.
Yep.
They sign Richard Dent. They sign Ricky Jackson. And then when it was like, they went and got Dion.
Right.
And that's how Steve Young got his ring. No disrespect, but you put Randall Cunningham in those kinds of situations, and the odds go up dramatically that Randall Cunningham is going to have a championship. So when I look at what's going on with the quarterbacks, on the one hand, and some people I respect very much, shout out to Paul Lawrence, and Paul will always say, what does first ballot really mean? If there's no hall within the hall, like Dion says, there's no secondary distinction. And in that respect, no, if you get in first ballot, second ballot, third, it doesn't matter, you're in. The difference is, and why it does matter, is that they are not having these extended conversations with quarterbacks. You come on the ballot and in you go, or off you go. So Donovan McNabb, who I think is in his 7th year, he may as well be in the senior pool at this point. Yeah. And what's going to happen is you're going to have 5 guys in the next, I think, 4 years who are all going to come up. And are they going to put Eli Manning in right away with these counting stats, with his career yardage in the top 10?
Yeah, we can do a whole podcast on Eli. I'm not going to get into it too much now.
But Rivers, Roethlisberger, and you have Breeze and Brady. Breeze and Brady obviously are first ballot Hall of Famers. But if the committee goes the way they've been going, I mean, the guy you want to keep an eye on is Eli Manning. If Eli Manning waits a year, cool. If he's in the semis his first year, he's in. If he's in the finals his first year, he's in.
Eli's the first year semi, I guarantee you.
Then that means he's in. Okay, so if Eli's the same, you can play the same game with Briggs. If Eli's a first year semis, then he's in. The next year is Rivers and Breeze. Breeze is in. If Rivers is first year semis, then he's in. I think the next year after that is Roethlisberger, and then you've got Brady coming 2028, and then you know that Matt Ryan is retiring soon, and he's going to get a look. And you know that Aaron Rodgers is retiring sometime soon. So what is going to happen to Randall? What's going to happen to Donovan
Stafford?
McNabb?
Will be an interesting one when he comes up.
Oh, that's terrible. And then what's going to happen to Steve McNair? So that's something to watch for anyone who wants to follow the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and one thing before we get to the finalists on just to go on about Randall is one, I've heard, well, he doesn't have the longevity. Well, neither did Kurt Warner, so that becomes irrelevant there. And two, the season he had in '98 with the Minnesota Vikings, you saw what kind of passer he had an incredible arm. I mean, he could throw the ball 80 yards easy.
Correct.
The Randall Cunningham, when you gave him elite weapons, you saw what kind of offense he had. But he was having so many health issues prior to '98 because from his style and how many vicious hits he took because it was a different game then. Randall Cunningham reinvented himself in '98 and became, and was, like you said, in some voting bodies, an MVP. And and that's almost like Jordan coming back in '96 and going, all right, I'm going to have the fadeaway jumper, and I'm not going to just drive to the basket play after play after play and get abused by the Pistons. He changed how he could, and he extended his career. Randall did that in '98, became a different style and utilized his weapons and had, you look at those stats now and go, well, that's not what, the guys are putting up now. But in 1998, those were massive offensive numbers.
Correct. And, nothing moves me less right now than some of these passing stats. The idea that people are going to look at Phillip Rivers and say, oh, he's 5th all time. You know what? When the 2 guys in your era are 30,000 yards ahead of you, I'm not like severely moved by you being 5th. And should Phillip Rivers be in the Hall of Fame? Yeah, sure, maybe. But he doesn't need to be in immediately. And there is a clear line between some of these guys, but the voters aren't drawing a line. They're just running it on a yay or nay.
All right. Well, like I said, was excited to talk Randall with you, but I do, we could go on for another 2 hours if we wanted to break down all the finalists, but kind of going through this a little bit. For those who don't know who the modern finalists are right now, Jared Allen, the of course longtime Chicago Bear, Minnesota Viking, Willie Anderson, the Bengals offensive lineman, Rondé Barber, who Jack's brought up a couple times, Dwight Freeney on the ballot, Torrey Holt on the ballot, Devin Hester, Andre Johnson, Albert Lewis, an interesting case from the Kansas City Chiefs, Darrelle Revis, Joe Thomas, the offensive lineman, Zach Thomas, the linebacker Zach's brought up, DeMarcus Ware, Reggie Wayne, and Patrick Willis. So, and Darren Woodson as well. So that's what the modern finalists are. if 5 are getting in, and look, there are more than 5 worthy candidates on here, but obviously 5 is what they choose to be the limit. So who are Jack Silverstein's 5 right now?
Like, who are the 5 who I think are going to get in?
If you want to do the 5 you think are going to get in, or the 5 you would put in out of this group, either one or both.
I mean, I would play it. Like I said, I would play it by the years. And I wrote a piece for John Turney's site, NFL Journal. It was called Memo to the Academy, Answer the Albert Lewis question first. Albert Lewis in his 20th year. You look at him and you think he belongs in the Football Hall of Fame, then you should vote him in now. Because the difference is that, if you vote in Rondé Barber over Lewis, then the difference is that Barber gets in and Lewis goes to the seniors and maybe never gets in. And if you vote in Lewis first, then the outcome is Lewis gets in and Barber gets in next year. Like, there's no loss there.
Sure.
So the way that I broke this down was that I think Joe Thomas is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer.
Agreed.
I think that DeMarcus Ware was a big surprise when he wasn't last year. I don't think they'll have him wait longer than 2. So
I agree. I think Ware's in this year.
So you can put him in. Now, the question is, to what degree do the voters look at and think about trends and stack ups, commonly referred to as log jams, which I think is a bad analogy, because the log jam occurs naturally in the river when you're moving lumber, and then you need a lumberjack to go and straighten it out. And in this case, the log jam is just happening because people just keep voting for fucking wide receivers for no good reason. I'm sorry, I'm getting fired up. It's 10:34 p.m. and got my, this is what it is. But yeah. So the question is, are they going to look at it and look at kind of like the breakdown of the positions, because they voted, they had Ward already, and then they put like Wayne in. They had Holt and then Ward, and then they added Wayne, and then they put Johnson up. They skipped Johnson over Holt last year in his first year, and then for some reason also added Bolden and Steve Smith. So they've got like all these wide receivers. You basically have to vote in, with Fitz coming in 26, you have to vote in a wide receiver every year for the next 5 years just to be able to dig your way out of that. So I would think that they would do that. And since they already said that, they already voted Andre Johnson last year's top 10, I would think that that would mean that he'd be the next wide receiver in. So I'm saying that he's number 3. And Revis has a ton of support, as he should. And the only reason that Revis is a wild card is this question around Albert Lewis. Now, obviously, this has already taken place. We're in the Schrodinger's paradox of Hall of Fame season, where we don't know what has happened, but it has already happened. And if you're able to open the box and look in, which I can't, but if you were able to open the box and look in, you would see the Hall of Fame people, for the class for this year, but they're not going to be announced until Thursday. So we don't know what happened, but something has happened. What we do know is that the presenter for Albert Lewis from Kansas City is going to get up and he's going to present. And basically right after that, at some point in there, Tony Dungy was going to stand up. And Tony Dungy, who coached Albert Lewis when he was DB's coach in Kansas City, is going to say something that he said on Clark Judge's and Ira Kaufman's podcast, I Test for Two, and shout out to Clark. He's going to get up there and he's going to say, of every player I ever coached, Albert Lewis graded out the highest. And then the voters are all going to say what Clark Judge said was, hold on a second, I need you to clarify that because you coached Peyton Manning and Derek Brooks and Edgerrin James and Marvin Harrison and John Lynch. And Tony Dungy's going to say, yep, Albert Lewis graded out highest. And then Albert Lewis is going to stand up, Tony Dungy's going to stand up and say, and Albert Lewis is my top 5 corner ever. And if I had to pick a corner to start a defense, I would take Mel Blount on one side and I would take Albert Lewis on the other side. So he's going to stand up and say those things. Then Rick Gosselin is going to get up there and shout out to Rick. He's been great to me as well. Clark, I'm really enjoying getting to know all these voters. But Rick is going to get up there and he's going to say, hey, by the way, Albert Lewis has the most block punts that we've recorded. with, I think it's 10, and he tackled a punter who didn't punt. That's basically 11, and he has a field goal block. He was an elite game-changing punt blocker. He was basically like, I guess, who's more physical than Dion? He was basically like Revis combined with Steve Tasker. So all these guys are going to stand up there and say this. And it seems to me that when you have Tony Dungy standing up and saying Albert Lewis is the first, one of two corners who I would start my defense with. I would start my secondary with these guys, and he graded out higher. And it seems like it'd be really weird to then turn around and vote for Rondé Barber, who he also coached and won, and didn't win a Super Bowl with, but like almost won a Super Bowl with. It seems like if I was in that room, I'd be like, Coach, are you saying that Albert Lewis was better than Rondé Barber? It seems like that's what you're saying. And Dungy, it seems, would say, yes, that is what I'm saying. And in that circumstance, I don't know how you would then turn around and vote for Rondé Barber if you knew that was going to send Albert Lewis, off, off. Into, I keep saying the abyss. I need another term. What is it? Siberia? Off to Siberia. So, but Rondé Barber's been in the room for a long time. So it might be a deluge of information on Albert Lewis that doesn't really get to, marinate long enough. And people might just hit their backup instinct, their muscle memory, and go with Rondé Barber. Or they might not go with either of them. So now you've got Joe Thomas, Jamarcus Ware, Andre Johnson. I think you could hold Revis back if you were dead set on Albert Lewis, but I think it'll be Revis. I've been saying Lewis, but the other two that could be are Zach Thomas, who's been in there a while, and Hester. All of these guys, except for Lewis, are guaranteed. All those guys I just named are guaranteed to get in. As far as the other guys, Jared Allen will be pretty soon. Torrey Holt will be the next wide receiver. Reggie Wayne will be in very soon after Torrey Holt. Darren Woodson now is getting enough momentum where he's clearly staying up in the ballot. So I think he will be getting in soon. An interesting one to watch that we've all been talking about is Willie Anderson. Willie Anderson was on nobody's radar for a very long time. And then he was doing an offensive line camp, and he asked the Bengals for all of his plays. They sent him like 2 big hard drives of all of his games. And Willie Anderson and his longtime offensive line coach with the Bengals, Paul Alexander, sat down and they watched all of his games, and they came up with this stat that started circulating, which was that Willie Anderson had only allowed 16 sacks in his entire career, 13-year career. So wow. He tweeted that, and then the very next year, he for the first time ever made the semis, and then the very next year after that, for the first time ever, he made the finals. But there have been people, myself included, who've been looking at it and being like, first of all, you allowed only 16 sacks in 13 years. And one of their claims was that there was a 3-year run in the middle where he didn't allow a sack. Well, if he didn't allow a sack, like we would have noticed. Like Richmond Webb, for example, faced Bruce Smith 3 times in his rookie year, 1990, when Bruce Smith was Defensive Player of the Year and had 20-something sacks. And he didn't get a sack on Richmond Webb. And that was a big storyline. And we didn't need all the game angles. We didn't need all 22. We didn't need Baldy's breakdown to know it. Like, they just knew it, and it was reported. Bruce Smith didn't get a sack on Richmond Webb. So, like, if Willie Anderson had gone 3 years without allowing a sack, we would have noticed. Additionally, PFF has grades and sack counts, sacks allowed counts since like 06, and they have him, I think of the 60, I think so. He says he allowed 16, but I think he allowed 6 according to PFF over his final like 2 seasons. So then that leaves only 10 sacks left for all those other seasons, except that I think it was 6 over 3. So that leaves 10 over 10, except for they say that in 3 seasons he didn't allow a sack. So now you start to piece it together just on the numbers, and it's like, so what? He allowed like 6 sacks for 3 years, and then none for 3 years, and then like 7 for whatever the math is. It doesn't really work. And there's a guy, Pierce, who's been pulling up a bunch of sacks that he, like, you don't never know the assignment. You can't say for sure was this graded as a sack allowed, but you look at it and you're like, I don't know, like this is a bunch of sacks in a 3-year span where he allegedly didn't allow any. I bring that all up to say that's another interesting person to watch because there's been a little bit of a pushback on that stat, and so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But with the exception of that as a murky area, Darren Woodson because he's late in the game, and Albert Lewis because he's on year 20, that leaves 12 guys. They're all getting in. And basically, that's another thing that everybody should be aware of. Talking about the Pro Football Hall of Fame, there's no such thing as being like snubbed if you're in the finals every year. Like if people write articles like, where's Reggie Wayne? It's like in the fucking finals. Like he's doing A-OK. Or, Fred Taylor had talked about that. Fred Taylor's been a semifinalist 4 years in a row. Like I said, he's out ahead of Sean Alexander and Jamal Lewis. He's out ahead of a bunch of guys who have about as many career rushing yards as him and have a bunch of things or 1 or 2 or 3 things that he doesn't have. MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, Super Bowl appearance, Super Bowl ring, Super Bowl MVP, rushing title, 2,000-yard season. Like there's a bunch of guys who have some mix of those things that Fred Taylor doesn't have. And Fred Taylor is the one who's out ahead and is on track to get in. So again, like as you pay attention to Football Hall of Fame, I think there's a lot of content, there's a lot of yelling, and it's kind of all geared toward like getting you fired up and pissed off and so and so retired. Is he a Hall of Fame? I saw AJ Green. Like, I don't know, AJ Green had a dope career. Like, let's just pause. Like Football Hall of Fame, it's important. It's not everything, but like there are patterns at play here. And the guys who are getting semifinalists and finalists, they're going to be in. So like, don't sweat it that much. Take a look more at Albert Lewis in his 20th year. Leslie O'Neal, who will be in his 20th year next year. Randall Cunningham, whose eligibility is up in 2026. Richmond Webb, who I think was the first rookie Pro Bowl tackle in like 20 years and made the Pro Bowl his first 7 seasons, including 4 when it was just the players voting, not the fans, who was all decade and has not gotten a sniff at the semis. Steve Wisniewski. There's a lot of guys like that. I mean, someone who I loved watching, who just poof was off the ballot in his 20th year was Greg Lloyd. And, those mid-90s Steelers defenses, they had Rod Woodson, they had Kevin Green, they had another guy who's another one of my favorites who should be in this conversation, which is Carnell Lake. All these guys who are on the back end or in the final 5 years of eligibility, if you want to hype somebody up, Herman Moore, he's got a little bit more time, but if you want to hype somebody up and try to start a campaign, talk about those guys. Don't just get stuck on the guy from your team. If you're a Colts fan, don't just get stuck on Reggie Wayne. If you're a Bears fan, don't just get stuck on Devin. If you're a Dolphins fan, don't just get stuck on Zach Thomas. If you're a Steelers fan, don't just get stuck on Hines Ward. There's a lot of great players who had wonderful careers, Hall of Fame worthy careers. They deserve to have that conversation. They deserve to be in that spotlight. They deserve to be in the room. It deserves to happen with quarterbacks. It deserves to happen with Randall Cunningham and Donovan McNabb. So look bigger and look at those guys later, because the guy you don't elect today is the senior who you're complaining about tomorrow.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I consider myself pretty good with football history, and these guys on these ballots, these are the guys that I watched, throughout. I'm old enough to have seen these guys.
Exactly.
And Albert Lewis, that was a guy I was like, oh yeah, good player. But listening to you talk about Albert Lewis, it's impressive, and that's a name that's a name where you hope that they really take a step back and really look at and not just go, well, we don't want to put in 2 defensive backs and we're going to make Darrelle Revis the first ballot guy. And, you hope that's not how someone gets pinched and pushed aside. But that kind of stuff I know does happen on there. This idea of a well-rounded ballot. We don't want to put in Rondé Barber, Darrelle Revis, and Albert Lewis on the same ballot.
Well, I don't think that would happen. And that's why.
No, I don't think it would either. But I'm just saying I don't like the idea that sometimes that is a part of the thought process.
Right. And that's why I was putting Barber in that 8th spot of like, well, I don't want to dismiss someone who's been up there so long, but I tell you what, if they voted in Rondé Barber and not Albert Lewis, then Tony Dungy's got to change. I mean, he's got to change a lot of things. Tony Dungy does, but I mean, he definitely also along with his social views. And that's a big middle finger for those. But he also has to change that, conversation starter in the presentation package, because if they somehow listened to Tony Dungy say Albert Lewis is the first corner I would pick, and they were like, yeah, but we're voting in the other guy you coached. I don't know, man. If you can't get in on a Hall of Fame coach sitting up there who, says this is the guy who was the highest graded player, and one of your other players was Peyton freaking Manning, then that is befuddling, and it suggests maybe, I don't know what. I don't want to speculate. It's hard to go inside the heads of 49 people, most of whom I've ever talked to. But that would be certainly something to watch.
Yeah. Jack, I've loved this conversation. I could talk to you for 3 more hours, but alas, I don't know if everyone would listen for 3 more hours. So we're going to have to do this again real soon. Maybe we'll get into our baseball conversation down the line as well. Jack and I love going back and forth on Twitter on a lot of this stuff. But yeah, if you're not following him, it's at Read Jack on Twitter. Great follow. The threads he puts together with history and putting everything in perspective are fantastic. The gems he finds in the newspaper archives. There's so much good content on his Twitter feed. So make sure you check him out if you haven't. Jack, thanks so much for so much time. I really enjoyed this, and we'll do it again.
I did too, Bill. I appreciate you having me, and thanks to everybody for listening. And I hope everybody's doing well. Everybody's families are doing well.